The old man had been lying in bed 9 of the general ward for 11 days when the discharge clerk came at 4:20 in the afternoon and told him, in front of the whole room, that he could not leave. Not because he was sick. Because he owed 4,200 cedis and the hospital did not release unpaid patients, it detained them, in the same bed, at 80 cedis a day. Until somebody came. He said nothing. He folded the thin blue blanket at the foot of the bed the way a man folds a thing he intends to give back. And he sat down on the edge of the mattress with his hands on his knees, and he looked at the wall. The clerk waited for an argument. There was no argument. 11 days, and nobody had come for him. The night nurse watched all of this from the medication trolley at the end of the aisle, and she did not know that the man in bed 9 had been counting something the entire time she had been on that ward, and she did not know that he had already written her name down. Her name was Adise Okafor. She was 29 years old, and she had been a staff nurse at Corlebu Teaching Hospital for 4 years, and her salary was 2,100 cedis a month, of which 900 went to rent. 420 went to her mother's blood pressure medication in Enugu, and 360 went on the Trotro from Kineshi and back, 6 days a week, twice a day. What was left she divided into envelopes. She had learned that from her grandmother, who had raised 6 children on a fish stall, and who had died in 1994, leaving behind nothing but a black leather purse with a broken clasp, sewn shut along one seam with red thread. Adise carried that purse to work every day. She carried it in a plastic bag inside her handbag so the rain would not touch it. She was thin. She had been thinner since March, when the hospital had shifted the night nurses to a rotation that paid the same and demanded 4 more shifts, and she had begun eating 1 proper meal a day at 2:00 in the afternoon, before the bus. Kenki and pepper. 4 cedis. She ate it standing up outside the gate so she would not use the staff canteen, which was 6 cedis 50. Her uniform was white, and it had been white for 4 years, which anybody who has washed a nurse's uniform by hand will tell you is not a small thing. She washed it in a bucket at 5 o'clock in the morning with a bar of blue soap, and she hung it under the eaves, and it was dry by the time she left. There was a burn mark on the left cuff from an iron in her first year. She had never bought a second uniform. The shoes were white canvas, resoled twice. She did not want much. She wanted her mother's medication to arrive on time. She wanted to sit the midwifery examination in November, which cost 860 cedis, and she had, folded inside the sewn seam of her grandmother's purse, 390 of it. The man in bed 9 had come in on a Tuesday with a heart that was working at half its strength and no next of kin on the form. He gave his name as Emmanuel. He was 71. He wore trousers that had been good once, and a navy blue cap that he did not let the porters take from him, and rubber slippers with the tread worn smooth on the outer edge, which is how a man's slippers wear when he has walked with a limp for 30 years. He smelled of camphor and old wool. His hands were enormous and cracked across the knuckles, and they never stopped moving. He was always folding something. The blanket, the corner of the sheet, the paper cup. And when Adese took his pressure at 2:00 in the morning, he would say, every night, the same 6 words. "Nurse, have they fed you today?" She said yes. She was lying. He knew she was lying. He never said so. He watched things. That was the second thing about the man in bed 9. He watched the drug trolley, and he watched the doors, and he watched which nurses looked at the chart before they looked at the patient's face. And once, on the 6th night, Adese looked up from a dressing and found him counting on his fingers with his lips moving, and she said, "What are you counting, sir?" And he closed his hand and said, "Nothing. Sleep is not coming." The billing office was on the ground floor, and it opened at 8 o'clock, and it closed at 4:30, and it did not open on Sundays. The clerk was Mr. Dexter Nwosu. He had worked there for 9 years, and he was not a cruel man in the way that people imagine cruelty. He came to work at 7:40. He had a wife and 2 daughters and a photograph of them under the glass on his desk. His name tag sat straight over his pocket, and he kept a red stamp and a black stamp, and he had never in 9 years stamped a file in the wrong color. There was a policy. Patients with outstanding balances were not discharged. This was written in a circular from 2009, and it had been reissued 4 times, and Dexter had a copy of all 4 in a folder behind him. He believed, and he would have told you so calmly, that if the policy did not exist, the hospital would collapse, and then nobody's mother would get a bed. He was following the rules. That is the whole engine of it. Nothing in that ward was done in anger. The other nurses knew about bed 9. The ward sister knew. 2 consultants walked past bed 9 every morning on their rounds, and they read the chart, and they said stable, and they moved to bed 10. A junior doctor once stopped and looked at the man for a moment, and then looked at the file and saw the red stamp and walked on. There is a specific way that a room full of people who could act, decide, together, without a word passing between them, that this is not the thing they will act on today. On the 9th night, a daisy found him sitting on the edge of the bed at 3:15 in the morning with the navy cap in his hands, turning it. He had taken the sheet off. He had folded it into a square on the mattress with the corners aligned. He was not going anywhere. There was nowhere to go. There was a window at the end of the ward, and it was open, and the harmattan had not come yet, so the air was thick and warm and smelled of disinfectant, and, faintly from the compound, of roasted corn. She said, "Papa Emmanuel, lie down." He said, "Whose bed is it?" She said, "Yours." He said, "It is not mine. I have not paid for it." And he put the cap on his head, and he sat up straighter than a 71-year-old man with a failing heart should be able to sit. And a daisy went to the linen store, and she stood between the shelves with her hand over her mouth for 4 minutes. And then she came back out and finished her round. On the 10th day, she went to the ward sister. She was told the file was with billing. She went to billing at 4:05. The queue was 11 people. She reached the counter at 4:26. Mr. Dexter Nwosu looked at her uniform, and then he looked at her face, and he asked whether she was family. She said she was the nurse. He said that nurses were not family. He said the balance was 4,218 cedis and 40 pesewas, and that it went up 80 cedis every midnight. He was not shouting. He wrote something and turned the page. Behind her, the queue moved forward half a step. At 4:30, he closed the ledger and stood up and went home to his daughters. The rain that night came down on the roof of the general ward like gravel thrown from a rooftop. It came straight down without wind. It ran off the gutters in ropes, and the drain in the compound stopped being a drain by 10:00, and the ambulance bay held 2 inches of standing water that reflected the lights. Adeze walked from the gate at 6:40 with her handbag held against her chest under her cardigan, and the water came over the tops of her canvas shoes, and by the time she reached the ward her uniform was wet from the knee down, and she stood under the hand dryer in the staff toilet for 11 minutes with her skirt held out, because a nurse cannot work in a wet uniform. At 1:00 in the morning she took a cup of tea to bed 9. Ginger, from the flask she carried, because the canteen was closed. She did not have anything else to give. She put it in his hands, and he held it, and did not drink it, and said, "Have they fed you today, nurse?" And this time she said no, and he nodded slowly. And he said, "Then, we are too." And she laughed once, out loud, in a dark ward at 1:00 in the morning. And then she stopped laughing and she sat down in the plastic chair beside bed 9, and she stayed there for 6 minutes, and neither of them said anything at all. Before she stood up, he said one more thing. He said, "Your hands are like my wife's." She sewed. Left-handed. Adeze looked at her own hands. She said her grandmother had been left-handed. She had never told anyone at that hospital that. On the 11th day, she did the thing. She went to the bank at Korle-Bu Junction on her 2:00 break. And she did not eat, and she withdrew 390 cedis from the sewn seam of her grandmother's purse, and 1,200 from her savings account, and she borrowed 2,628 from 4 people. 900 from Nkechi in theater. 800 from her cousin in Tema. 600 from a man in Enugu who was her father's friend and who did not ask what it was for. 328 from the ward sister, who counted it out of her handbag and said nothing and looked at the wall while she did it. It came to 4,218 cedis. She was 40 pesewas short. She found the 40 pesewas in the bottom of the plastic bag that held the purse. She paid it at 4:11 in the afternoon on the 11th day. Mr. Dexter Nwosu counted the notes twice. He asked her to write her name and her relationship to the patient on the receipt. She wrote her name. Under relationship, she wrote, "Nurse." He looked at that word for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he took the red stamp off the file and put the black one on, and he pushed the paper across the counter, and he said, "You people should not do this. You will be doing it every month." And he was, in his way, trying to be kind. That is the thing nobody tells you about men like Dexter. They are trying to be kind, inside the rules, and the rules are the cruelty, and they cannot see the rules because they are standing inside them. She did not tell the man in bed 9. She put the discharge paper on his blanket at 6:00 in the evening, and she said the account had been settled, and she turned to go. And he caught her wrist. His hand was enormous and dry, and it did not squeeze. He said, "Who settled it?" She said, "The hospital made an arrangement." He said, "Nurse," and that was all. Just her title, in the dark, and she did not answer, and he let go of her wrist, and she went and stood in the linen store again. He left the next morning at 7:15. He walked out of the general ward of Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital in his good trousers and his rubber slippers and his navy blue cap, and he stopped at the door and he turned around and he looked back at bed 9 for a long moment. And then he looked at the medication trolley where Adeze was signing the handover book, and he raised one hand and she raised hers, and he went out into the light. There was nobody waiting for him. She checked. She stood at the window at the end of the ward and watched him walk across the compound alone, past the ambulance bay, past the corn cellar, out through the gate onto the road, and he turned left, and he was gone. And Adeze went home and slept for 4 hours, and woke up and looked at her grandmother's purse with the seam cut open and empty, and she was 2,628 cedis in debt, and 860 cedis further from November than she had been on Monday. If you can feel where this is going, subscribe now. Because what that old man had been counting on his fingers for 11 nights was not sleep. And when the letter came, it did not come to Adeze. 9 days later, on a Thursday, a woman came to the ward and asked for her by her full name. Her name was Constance, and she was 68, and she sold nothing and worked nowhere, and had been coming to the general ward at Korle-Bu on Thursday afternoons for 19 years to sit with patients who had no visitors. Everybody knew her. Nobody knew anything about her. She had never once given her surname to the register at the gate. She wore lavender, and she smelled of it, and she stood at the end of bed 9, which now held a young man with a broken hip, and she said to Adaise, the old man, "Emmanuel, did he have a mark on his left hand, here, across the knuckles?" Adaise said yes. Constance sat down in the plastic chair. She said she had watched Adaise for 4 years. She said she had watched her carry a flask and eat outside the gate and put her own money in the poor box in June when the woman in bed 4 could not buy her own drugs. She said she had never said anything because it was not her place. Then she opened her bag and took out a folded newspaper, 4 days old, and she put it on the trolley and she smoothed it flat with the palm of her hand and she pointed at a photograph on page 5. At a man standing behind a lectern, 20 years younger, in a dark suit, with enormous hands folded in front of him, and a limp that the camera could not see. Adaise looked at the caption for a long time. Then she looked at the man's face. Then she put the newspaper down on the trolley, and she put both hands flat on the trolley, and she stood there, very straight, and the young man in bed 9 asked her if she was all right. And she did not hear him. Constance said, "He is not sick the way you were told. He has been in 4 hospitals this year." She folded the newspaper and put it back in her bag. She said, "He is looking for something. He has been looking for 11 years. She stood up to go. At the door she turned around and she said the only thing she ever said that Adaise repeated afterward to her own daughter 30 years later. She said, "Child, what you did in the dark, when there was no one to see it, and no one to pay you for it, that is not a good deed. That is who you are. Nobody can take it, and nobody can give it to you." And she went out into the corridor, and Adaise never saw her again. Emmanuel Chukwuemeka Achebe had founded a company in 1981 with 1 lorry, and by 2009 it moved medical supplies through 6 countries. And in 2013 he had signed it all into a foundation and stepped out of the building and had not been photographed since. He had a heart that was working at half strength. He had no children. He had buried a wife in 2015, a woman who sewed, left-handed. And after that he had begun going into general wards under his own first name with an empty next of kin line on the form, and lying in the bed and watching. He had been to Korle-Bu twice before. He had lain in bed 9 for 11 days, and he had counted, on his fingers, every night, how many nurses read the chart before they read the face, how many stopped when nobody was watching, how many said the patient's name. In 11 days and 4 hospitals across 2 years, the number he was counting had never once gone above 2, and it had never, not once, been the same person twice. He knew what the balance was. He could have cleared it from the bed with a telephone. He had, in fact, been waiting to see how long the ward would let a man sit at 80 cedis a day with a folded sheet and his cap in his hands, and how many people would walk past, and whether anyone at all, would go to the billing counter at 4:05 in the afternoon and stand in a queue of 11 people to argue with a policy on behalf of a man who had nothing to give them. He had not expected her to pay it. He had not expected anybody to pay it. When the discharge paper appeared on his blanket at 6 Bala Road in the evening, he had lain awake the entire night, and at 7:15 in the morning he had walked out and turned left and stood on the road for 20 minutes without moving. On the 17th of the month, a Monday, a black car came into the compound at Korle-Bu at 9:00 in the morning, and 4 people got out of it, and one of them was a woman in a dark suit carrying a folder, and word went up through the hospital the way water goes through cloth. The consultants came out of the offices. The ward sister straightened her cap. A junior doctor who had once glanced at a red stamped file and walked on stood very straight against the wall of the corridor. And through the door of the administration block, behind all of them, walked an old man in a navy blue cap and rubber slippers. And he did not look at anybody and the corridor went quiet in front of him, the way a road goes quiet. Mr. Dexter Nwosu was at his counter with his red stamp and his black stamp. He stood up when the group came in. He straightened his name tag. He was smiling, because he had decided that these were important people and he understood important people, and he said, "Good morning, please. How can we, Emmanuel Achebe, put one piece of paper on the counter?" It was a receipt, 4,218 cedis and 40 pesewas, and a name written in a nurse's handwriting, and under relationship, one word. He said, "Read it to me." Dexter picked it up. His hand came up to his glasses. It stopped in the air, halfway, and stayed there, and then it came down, and he did not read anything. He put the receipt on the desk and put both hands on the edge of the desk. The photograph of his daughters was under the glass by his left thumb. Emmanuel said, 9 years. Not a question. Dexter said nothing. Emmanuel said, "Where is she?" They brought a Daisy up from the ward in a wet uniform. She had been in theater since 6. She stood in the doorway of the billing office with her hands at her sides in front of 30 people. And the old man from bed 9 turned around and took off his cap, and he held it against his chest with both of those enormous hands, and he said 4 words to her. He said, "Have they fed you?" And Adeze Okafor, 29 years old, 2,628 cedis in debt, standing in the administration block of Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital in a uniform she had washed by hand for 4 years, said, "Not today, sir." And the room did not make a sound. What happened after that took 7 months, and none of it was announced. The debt detention policy at Korle-Bu, Circular 14 of 2009, was withdrawn on the 9th of the following month. Not amended, withdrawn. In its place came a hardship review that met on Tuesdays and Fridays, and no patient in that hospital has been held in a bed for a bill since. The 80 cedi accrual on unpaid inpatients was abolished, and the sums collected under it over 11 years were audited. And what was recoverable was recovered, and it went into a fund. Mr. Dexter Nwosu was not dismissed. Adeze asked that he not be. She said it in a room with 4 lawyers in it, and when the old man asked her why, she said, he was following a rule. Kill the rule. Dexter now sits, once a month, in the first hour of the induction session that every new billing clerk at that hospital attends. He reads out the policy that was withdrawn. Then he reads out a receipt. He has done this for 11 years, and he has never once got through it without stopping in the middle. The Chukwuemeka Foundation opened its first clearing fund at Korle-Bu in April with 3 million cedis for inpatients with no next of kin, dispersed on the recommendation of ward nursing staff and nobody else. Not the consultants, not the administrators, the nurses, because the old man had lain in bed 9 for 11 days and had learned exactly who in that building looks at a face before they look at a chart. Adeze Okafor's debts were paid within the week by a bank transfer she did not authorize and could not refuse. She sat the midwifery examination in November. She passed it. She was offered a position in the foundation office in Accra with a salary that would have moved her mother out of Enugu in a year, and she turned it down. And she went back to nights on the general ward, and she is there still. Emmanuel Achebe thought he was looking for a hospital that could be fixed. But what he found in bed 9, on the 11th day, was a woman who cut open her grandmother's purse for a man whose surname she did not know, at a counter where nobody was watching, for a debt that was not hers, knowing that no one would ever thank her and that she would go hungry on Thursday because of it. She did not do it to be seen. She did not know he was anyone. That is the entire point. That is the only reason any of it happened. You will be tested, all of you, in a corridor with nobody in it. Not in the moment that is filmed. In the moment at 4:11 in the afternoon when the queue has gone and the man behind the counter is closing his ledger and there is nothing to gain and nothing to prove and no one will ever know either way. What you do there is not something you decide. It is something you find out, and the world will walk past you for years and read your chart and never once look at your face. And then one day, without warning, it will ask you to read a receipt aloud, and you will not be able to. A Daisy still carries the black leather purse with the broken clasp. The seam that her grandmother sewed shut with red thread is open now, and she has never sewn it back. And she keeps nothing in it. At 1:00 in the morning, she goes down the aisle of the general ward with a flask of ginger tea, and at bed 9, whoever is lying there, whatever their file says, she stops, and she puts her hand on the rail, and she asks them the same question. Every night. The same 6 words. She asks them whether anybody has fed them today. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest, because nobody in the comments will know if you lie. A Daisy paid 4,200 cedis she did not have for a stranger who could give her nothing, on a night when nobody would ever have known she walked away. And afterwards, when she was standing in a room full of lawyers, she asked them to spare the man who had detained him. If you had been standing at that counter at 4:11 in the afternoon, with your rent in your hand, and your mother's medicine, and your examination in November, and a queue behind you, and a policy in front of you, would you have paid it? And if you would not have, do you think you would be able to say so out loud? Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read it. And if this story reached something in you, subscribe. This channel is for stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until the day they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.